A successful black entrepreneur gets pulled over for no reason. A corrupt officer thinks he can control everything. But when the lies start unraveling, an entire system begins to crack. Who's really pulling the strings? And in the end, will justice prevail, or is it just an illusion? The late afternoon sun cast long golden streaks across the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. The streets bustled with energy as luxury cars glided between lanes, their polished surfaces reflecting the fiery hues of the sky. Business executives in tailored suits emerged from high-end restaurants, their laughter blending with the honking of impatient taxis. Office workers hurried toward the subway, eager to escape the city's relentless rhythm. David Carter sat behind the wheel of his Vanguard X9, the latest luxury model from his own company. The deep hum of the engine was a familiar comfort, a reminder of how far he had come. He had designed every detail of this car, from the leather-stitched seats to the state-of-the-art suspension. Yet, even as he navigated through the financial district, he felt like an outsider. He was used to the double takes, the lingering stares of curiosity, skepticism, or outright doubt. A black man in a car like this? To some, it didn't add up. It never did. As he pulled up to a red light at a busy intersection, he sensed a presence before he even saw it. To his left, a police cruiser idled at the stoplight. The officer inside, a middle-aged white man with sharp eyes and a jaw set in quiet authority, was staring at him. David didn't look over right away. He had learned over the years that direct eye contact could be misinterpreted. Instead, he adjusted his grip on the wheel and focused on the traffic ahead. The light turned green, and David eased forward, but something made him glance into his rearview mirror. The police car followed. At first, he told himself it was nothing. The officer could be heading in the same direction. But when David switched lanes, so did the cruiser. When he turned onto a quieter street, it turned too. His fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel as he exhaled through his nose. Not tonight. He had just left an important meeting, finalizing expansion plans for Vanguard Motors. He wasn't in the mood for this game. A few more turns, a few more glances in the mirror. The police car remained. Then, as he slowed down near his neighborhood, the unmistakable flicker of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. David's stomach tightened. This wasn't a coincidence. The street was quiet, save for the occasional hum of an engine in the distance. Streetlights cast a dim orange glow over the pavement, their light reflecting off the polished surface of the Vanguard X9. It was a peaceful neighborhood, one where people expected silence at this hour. But tonight, the flashing red and blue lights shattered that peace. David Carter exhaled slowly, his fingers momentarily tightening around the steering wheel. He had been here before. Not on this exact street. Not with this exact cop. But in this exact situation. He had learned over the years that there were rules in moments like this. Rules that weren't written down but had been drilled into his mind since childhood. Keep your hands visible. Speak calmly. Don't give them a reason. He rolled down the window. His movements deliberate, controlled. The officer stepped forward, flashlight in hand, angling it into the car with a practiced motion. The beam swept across the dashboard, the seats, then landed on Carter's face. Evening. The officer said, voice neutral but firm. Where are you headed tonight? Carter met his gaze without hesitation. Home. Is there a problem, officer? The flashlight lingered for a moment longer before dipping slightly. License and registration. Carter reached into the center console, pulling out the documents he had handed over countless times before. As he extended them, he noticed the hesitation in the officer's expression. Officer Mark Reynolds. His badge number was barely visible in the glow of the flashing lights. Reynolds took the documents but didn't look at them right away. Instead, his eyes flicked back up, studying Carter with an intensity that made his intentions clear. He wasn't just checking paperwork. He was looking for something. Anything. That didn't add up. Nice car, Reynolds remarked, tapping a finger against the door. It yours? Carter didn't let his expression change. It's registered in my name. You can verify that. Reynolds made a sound in his throat that wasn't quite agreement. I've seen a lot of stolen vehicles in this area, he said, his tone casual but weighted. Luxury cars especially. Carter let the words hang between them for a beat too long. Feeling the weight of what wasn't being said. Is that so? he finally replied. Reynolds nodded, looking down at the registration but making no move to return it. I need you to step out of the vehicle, sir. Carter stayed still. And why is that? The officer's stance shifted slightly. Just enough to be noticeable. Standard procedure. Standard procedure for what? A routine traffic stop? You haven't told me what law I've broken. Reynolds' jaw tightened. I'm not going to ask again. Carter exhaled slowly. He knew how this played out if he refused. He also knew that complying didn't always mean walking away unscathed. Just as he was weighing his options, movement from across the street caught his attention. A man standing outside a small cafe had turned his phone toward them. The dim glow of the screen unmistakable. Reynolds saw it too, his lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers flexing slightly near his belt, not quite reaching for his weapon, but close enough to remind Carter that it was there. Step out of the car, Reynolds repeated, his voice lower now, unless you want tonight to go a lot worse for you. Carter held his gaze. He could feel the shift in the air, the silent threat curling beneath the officer's words. This wasn't about the car. It never was. The night had settled fully now. The last traces of daylight long gone. The streetlights cast uneven pools of yellow along the quiet neighborhood, stretching shadows over the pavement. The flashing red and blue behind David Carter had stopped spinning, but the tension remained thick in the air. Inside his car, Carter kept his hands resting loosely on the wheel, his breathing steady. He had learned over the years that these encounters weren't about what was legal or fair. They were about power. Who had it? Who controlled the moment? He refused to let Reynolds dictate this one. The crackle of the police radio cut through the silence. A voice, firm and neutral, spoke from the speaker clipped to Reynolds' vest. The registration is clear. Vehicle belongs to David Carter. No active warrants. No violations. A brief pause. A heartbeat. Then Reynolds clicked off the radio, exhaling sharply through his nose. Carter could see the moment of hesitation, the split second in which the officer realized he had no legitimate reason to keep this going. And yet, instead of stepping back, Reynolds dug his heels in. So, you really do own it, he muttered, more to himself than to Carter. His hand lingered on the registration paperwork, his eyes narrowing. I've seen a lot of fraud lately. You sure these papers are real? Carter's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly. He kept his voice even. If you have reason to believe they aren't, feel free to verify them through your system. Otherwise, I'd like to be on my way. Reynolds didn't move. A car like this, a man in your position. You expect me to believe this was bought with clean money? There it was. Not subtle, not coded. A direct implication wrapped in a thin layer of condescension. Carter forced himself to unclench his jaw. I don't have to prove anything to you, officer. I've given you everything you asked for. Reynolds shifted his weight, his right hand moving closer to his belt, hovering near his holster. Not grabbing the gun, not yet, just a silent message that the option was there. For the first time that night, Carter felt something colder than anger seep into his chest. Movement from the sidewalk caught both their attention. A young man with a phone raised in one hand had stepped closer. His eyes flicked between Carter and Reynolds, the glow of his screen reflecting off his glasses. Officer, the man called, voice firm but not aggressive. The car's registered legally. Why are you still holding him here? Carter saw the momentary flicker of irritation cross Reynolds' face. The officer turned his head slightly toward the bystander. His voice clipped. Step back. This is a police matter. The man didn't lower his phone. I'm just making sure everything's documented. You know, for transparency. Reynolds' fingers twitched. A few other patrons from the nearby cafe had turned their heads now, sensing something unfolding. A couple stood near the entrance, watching quietly. A man by a parked car had stopped mid-step, hands in his pockets. Carter felt the shift. This was no longer just between him and Reynolds. The officer knew it too. A muscle in Reynolds' jaw flexed before he turned back to Carter. You're free to go, he said, his voice tight. He thrust the papers back through the open window. The movement sharp, dismissive. But don't think this is over. Carter took the documents, holding Reynolds' gaze for a long moment before setting them aside. He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Reynolds lingered a second longer before stepping back, turning sharply on his heel. He strode toward his cruiser. his shoulders stiff with barely restrained frustration. Carter exhaled slowly, shifting the car into drive. As he pulled away, he glanced one last time into his rearview mirror. Reynolds was standing by his car, watching him go. Then Carter's phone buzzed against the center console. A message from an unknown number. "Be careful, he'll be back." Carter's fingers hovered over the screen. Someone was watching. Someone inside the system. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass-paneled walls of Vanguard Motors headquarters, casting a sharp contrast between the gleaming surface of David Carter's desk and the tension brewing beneath it. His office, perched on the top floor, overlooked the Chicago skyline, a view he had worked years to earn. Yet today, it felt like nothing more than a backdrop to something darker, something he couldn't quite place yet. He leaned back in his chair, phone in hand, rereading the message that had appeared the night before. "Be careful, he'll be back." A warning, but from whom? He tapped his fingers against the desk, then scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he trusted. 15 minutes later, his screen lit up with an incoming call. "David," the voice on the other end said. "I ran the number. And? It's masked. Whoever sent that text knows how to cover their tracks. No name, no location, nothing to trace." Carter exhaled, rubbing his temple. That didn't make sense. If someone had the resources to hide their identity like this, why reach out at all? "Any chance it's a cop?" he asked. "Maybe," his contact replied. "Or someone who wants you to think it is." That was the problem. He had no way of knowing whether the message had been a lifeline or a setup. Down on the street, a police cruiser idled in front of an abandoned warehouse. Officer Mark Reynolds sat inside, phone pressed to his ear. "This isn't going away," said the voice on the other end of the line. It was calm, deliberate, a man who was used to giving orders. Carter's got eyes on him now. "If you want to handle this, you'll need leverage." Reynolds smirked. "Leverage, huh?" He glanced up at the towering building across the street. "I think I can work with that." The man on the phone didn't laugh, but Reynolds could hear the approval in his silence. "Make sure it sticks," the voice said. The call ended. At Vanguard Motors, Carter had barely settled into his next meeting when his office line rang. The voice on the other end belonged to one of his financial managers, but it carried an unease that made Carter sit up straight. "There's been an issue with one of our accounts," the man said. "A wire transfer went through this morning. A large one." Carter frowned. "What do you mean? A wire transfer? $5 million. Moved offshore. Cayman Islands." That wasn't possible. Vanguard Motors had strict security protocols. No transaction that large could move without his authorization. "Who approved it?" Carter asked, already bracing for the answer. Silence. Then, the hesitant reply. "You did." A knock at the door pulled his attention away from the call. Two men in dark suits stood in the doorway, badges flashing as one of them spoke. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, his voice flat, professional. "We're with the FBI. We need you to come with us." Carter set his phone down carefully, his mind racing. He had expected retaliation from Reynolds. But this was something else. Outside, Reynolds watched from across the street, arms crossed over his chest, a slow smile creeping onto his face. But he wasn't the only one watching. A few cars down, Lisa Torres sat behind the wheel of her unmarked vehicle, her fingers tapping lightly against her laptop keyboard. On the screen in front of her was Reynolds' personnel file, a long list of complaints and internal investigations, cases that had quietly disappeared. She narrowed her eyes, scrolling through the details. He was getting reckless, and reckless men made mistakes. She clicked her tongue and muttered under her breath, "It's time I step in." The FBI field office in downtown Chicago was built for function, not comfort. Harsh fluorescent lighting cast a sterile glow over the room, the walls a dull shade of gray that seemed to sap the warmth from everything inside it. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and printer ink, the kind of scent that clung to government buildings like an unspoken warning. Nothing good ever happened here. David Carter sat in the center of a small interrogation room, the chair beneath him rigid, unforgiving. A metal table separated him from the two men across from him, Agent Miller, who had the stony expression of someone who had seen too much, and Agent Rhodes, whose careful, measured tone suggested he preferred persuasion over force. They had already spent 15 minutes circling the same topic, and Carter could tell they were waiting for him to crack. Miller slid a manila folder across the table and flipped it open. A few sheets of paper. A couple of printed screenshots. He tapped a page with his index finger. $5 million, he said, his voice flat, transferred from a Vanguard Motors account to an offshore entity in the Cayman Islands. The company doesn't exist. That's textbook money laundering. Carter didn't so much as blink. And you think I'm dumb enough to do that with my own company's account? Rhodes leaned forward slightly, hands folded in front of him. We think it's worth looking into. Either this transaction was authorized by you, or someone is setting you up. He paused. If it's the latter, this is the moment to tell us. Carter could see the play. They weren't convinced he was guilty, but they weren't letting him walk out the door just yet. He needed to be careful with how he handled this. Let me see the details of the transaction, he said. Miller exchanged a glance with Rhodes before shaking his head. That's not how this works. Carter sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly. So let me get this straight. You think I might be the victim of fraud, but you won't let me see the evidence that could clear me? Rhodes hesitated, but Miller didn't flinch. That's not our concern right now. Carter's jaw tightened. He had no doubt this was Reynolds' doing, but the officer didn't have the reach to pull something like this off alone. That meant someone higher up had taken notice. And whoever it was, they weren't just trying to rattle him. They wanted him buried. A few miles away, Sergeant Lisa Torres was staring at her own set of documents. Brows furrowed in concentration. She had spent the last hour digging into Officer Reynolds' personnel file. And the deeper she went, the worse it got. Multiple complaints of misconduct, use of excessive force, a handful of internal affairs investigations that had mysteriously gone nowhere. None of it surprised her. But what caught her attention was the pattern. Reynolds had been shielded, protected by someone with enough influence to keep his record clean. And if that was the case, then he wasn't just another bad cop. He was a pawn in something bigger. She picked up her phone and dialed. A voice answered on the second ring. Torres? I need you to pull call records for Officer Mark Reynolds, she said. Anything unusual in the last 48 hours? There was a brief silence. You expecting something specific? Lisa glanced at her screen, at the names that kept appearing in Reynolds' past complaints. One in particular stood out. I have a feeling he's taking orders from someone we should be worried about. Back at the FBI office, Carter had just resigned himself to another round of pointless questioning when the door opened. A man stepped inside, dressed in a crisp suit, carrying a sleek leather briefcase. He was younger than Carter expected, but something about him seemed familiar. Then the man smiled, just slightly, and Carter felt his stomach drop. Nathan Ellis, the journalist from the cafe, the one who had filmed everything. Carter narrowed his eyes. You're not a lawyer. Ellis set the briefcase down on the table, still grinning. No, but I have something better. He reached inside and pulled out a USB drive, placing it carefully in front of Carter. This, Ellis said, lowering his voice, is the proof you need. The interrogation room was cold. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made every second stretch longer than it should. The walls were bare, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. It was the kind of place designed to make people talk. But David Carter wasn't about to give them anything. He kept his expression unreadable, watching as Nathan Ellis placed the USB drive carefully on the table between them. The journalist's face was calm, but there was something in his eyes, urgency, maybe even fear. I've been following your story since last night, Ellis said, keeping his voice measured. I think you need to see this before things get worse. Carter didn't move. He could feel the weight of the two FBI agents still in the room. Their attention locked on every movement, every flicker of emotion that crossed his face. He wasn't about to give them an opening. He let the silence stretch before finally speaking. And I'm supposed to trust a reporter? Ellis leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. The recording on this drive. It's between Officer Reynolds and someone higher up. I don't know exactly who, but they're pulling the strings. They've been planning this for a while. Carter, this isn't just harassment. They're trying to take you down for good. Carter's jaw tightened, but he kept his breathing steady. He already knew Reynolds had an agenda. But if this was bigger than just one cop with a grudge, he needed to know who else was involved. Across town, inside the Chicago Police Department, Mark Reynolds paced the dimly lit hall outside his office. His phone was pressed tight against his ear, his fingers tapping anxiously against his thigh. "Carter hasn't been charged yet," he said, voice low and sharp. "They're still questioning him, but nothing's sticking." The voice on the other end of the line was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You were supposed to make sure this was airtight." Reynolds exhaled hard. "Ellis got involved. He's got a recording of me. If it gets out, you're done." The voice interrupted. "And so am I." There was a pause, a silence thick with unspoken threats. Then the voice continued, slower this time. "Fix it." The line went dead. Back at the FBI office, Carter finally reached for the USB. He glanced at the agents before sliding it into the laptop in front of them. The screen flickered, and then the audio file began to play. A voice crackled through the speakers. "Reynolds. Carter's not getting out of this," he was saying. "I've got the FBI watching him. The department, too. There's nowhere for him to run." A second voice came through. Deeper, more controlled. "Good. If he tries to push back, make sure he disappears." Carter clenched his fists. This wasn't just about setting him up. This was about eliminating him entirely. Agent Miller and Agent Rhodes exchanged glances. Whatever doubts they had before were slipping. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Lisa Torres sat in her parked car, staring at a file on her laptop. A new email had just arrived, an anonymous tip. She clicked it open, and there it was, the same recording, sent to her directly. She exhaled slowly. This wasn't just corruption. This was a full-blown conspiracy. And she knew exactly where to start digging. At that same moment, Reynolds pushed through the doors of the police station, walking briskly toward his car. His mind was racing. He needed a plan, fast. But what he didn't see, what he never noticed, was the figure standing in the shadows, watching. A phone buzzed softly in the dark. A single message appeared on the screen. "If he fails, you're next." The underground parking lot beneath the Chicago Police Department was nearly deserted at this hour. Dim overhead lights flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the concrete floor. The air was heavy with the scent of oil and damp cement. Footsteps echoed through the empty space. Sharp and hurried, Mark Reynolds moved with purpose, his heart pounding harder than he wanted to admit. He kept his head low, his eyes darting toward every darkened corner as he strode toward his car. His mind raced through the night's events, the recording, the FBI, Carter still walking free. It wasn't supposed to go like this. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb hovering over a recent call. No answer. He tried again. Still nothing. Then, a vibration. A message appeared on the screen. "You failed. You're on your own now." His stomach turned to ice. He stopped in his tracks, swallowing hard as a drop of sweat traced its way down the side of his face. The people protecting him, the ones who had assured him Carter would be dealt with, had just abandoned him. "Not like this," he muttered under his breath, gripping his phone tightly. As he reached for his car door, a voice echoed through the garage. "Didn't think they'd cut you loose so fast, did you?" Reynolds froze, stepping out from the shadows. Lisa Torres moved into the dim light, her expression unreadable. She held up her phone, tilting the screen just enough for him to see the recording, his own voice damning him. Reynolds clenched his jaw. "You think that's enough to bring me down?" Torres took another step closer. "I don't have to bring you down. The system you've been hiding behind is already doing that for me." For a moment, there was silence. Then Reynolds smiled, slow, bitter. "You really think the system is going to save you?" Then he lunged. Torres anticipated the move. The second he reached for her, she pivoted, sidestepping as she grabbed his wrist and twisted. Reynolds let out a sharp grunt as she shoved him backward, sending him crashing against the side of a nearby SUV. But he wasn't done. As she reached for her handcuffs, he moved faster than she expected, his hand dipping toward his belt. The flash of metal was her only warning. A gunshot rang out. Torres threw herself to the side, the bullet missing her by inches, ricocheting off the concrete floor with a sharp ping. Somewhere above them, a security alarm blared to life. Someone had heard the shot. Someone had called it in. Reynolds looked around wildly. knowing time was slipping through his fingers. Then, without hesitation, he sprinted for his car. Torres scrambled to her feet. But before she could close the distance, the engine roared to life. Tires screeched against the pavement as Reynolds peeled out, disappearing into the night. Torres stood there for a long moment, her breathing heavy, her pulse hammering in her ears. She clenched her fists, forcing the adrenaline to settle. Then she reached for her phone. Across town, David Carter sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at his phone screen. A new message had just come in. Reynolds isn't your only problem. There's someone bigger pulling the strings. Carter tightened his grip on the phone. This wasn't over, not even close. David Carter sat in the dimly lit apartment, his phone still glowing with the last message he had received. The silence of the room pressed in around him, thick and unrelenting. Outside, the city continued its restless hum. Cars passing in the distance. Sirens wailing somewhere far away. But in here, everything felt still. Reynolds isn't your only problem. There's someone bigger pulling the strings. He exhaled slowly, turning his attention back to the laptop in front of him. The USB drive Ellis had given him was still inserted. The screen frozen on the audio file that had cracked everything open. He replayed it again, listening carefully this time. Not just to Reynolds' words, but to the voice speaking to him. Then, something caught his ear, a detail he had overlooked before. Keep in touch with Odin. He knows how to handle this. Carter frowned. He hadn't noticed that name the first time. Was Odin a code name? Another officer? Someone higher up in the system? He wasn't sure, but what he did know was that he wasn't going to figure it out sitting here. He picked up his phone and sent a message to Nathan Ellis. Meet me in an hour. Same place. The reply came almost instantly. Already on my way. An hour later, Carter sat at a small table in a nearly empty cafe on the south side of the city. The place was quiet, save for the hum of an old refrigerator behind the counter and the occasional clatter of a coffee cup. Ellis walked in, looking around nervously before slipping into the seat across from him. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and his knee bounced slightly under the table. You're acting like someone's about to shoot you, Carter said, keeping his voice low. Ellis gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, well, maybe someone is. Carter leaned forward. Tell me about Odin. Ellis hesitated, glancing toward the window before finally pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. He smoothed it out on the table, revealing a photograph, old, slightly worn at the edges. It was a group of men, all in uniform, cops. Carter's eyes scanned the faces until he found the one he recognized. Reynolds, standing tall, looking younger, but with the same smug expression. And next to him, a man Carter didn't know, older, with sharp, calculating eyes. Ellis tapped the man's face with his finger. That's James Holloway, he said, deputy chief of the Chicago Police Department. Carter sat back slightly. He had heard the name before. Holloway was a man with power. Someone who had been in the system for decades. If he was involved, this was bigger than just Reynolds trying to take him down. Reynolds wasn't acting alone. Ellis continued. He never was. Holloway has been protecting him for years. Covering for him. And if he's Odin, then he's the one calling the shots. Carter stared at the photograph, his mind working quickly. If Holloway was involved, then this wasn't just about getting rid of him. It was about protecting an entire network. A system designed to keep people like Reynolds untouchable. Across town, Lisa Torres was running into the same wall. She had been combing through every record she could find on Reynolds. But the deeper she went, the more things started to disappear. Files that should have been accessible were suddenly restricted. Reports that once contained complaints against him had been edited, redacted. Someone was cleaning up his mess. When she tried to access internal documents on officers who had worked with Reynolds over the years, a message popped up on her screen. Access denied. Her stomach tightened. Someone was shutting her out. That only meant one thing. Whoever was protecting him wasn't just another officer. It was someone with real power. And she had a pretty good idea of who that might be. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds wasn't running. He was sitting in a private booth in an upscale restaurant, his hands clasped together on the table in front of him. Across from him, James Holloway swirled the glass of whiskey in his hand, his expression unreadable. You really made a mess of things, Holloway said finally, his voice quiet but sharp. Reynolds swallowed hard. I can fix it, Holloway sighed, setting his glass down. No, you can't. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. Because for the first time in his life, he realized something. To men like Holloway, he was disposable. The restaurant was nearly empty now. The last few patrons had left, and the waitstaff moved quietly, clearing tables with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from working in a place where discretion was valued above all else. The private dining room, tucked away at the back, was bathed in low, golden light, but the air inside felt cold. Mark Reynolds sat stiffly, his fingers wrapped tightly around a glass of whiskey he hadn't touched. Across from him, James Holloway leaned back in his chair, calm, unreadable. A thick folder lay between them on the table. You have any idea how much effort I've put into keeping this system intact? Holloway's voice was measured, almost bored. How many fires I've put out for people like you? Reynolds didn't answer. He didn't have to. Holloway slid the folder forward. Go ahead, take a look. Reynolds hesitated, then flipped it open. His breath caught in his throat. Inside were documents, reports. His reports. Complaints that had been wiped clean. Investigations that had quietly disappeared. Years of misconduct, all laid out in front of him like a carefully arranged crime scene. He swallowed hard. I've always been loyal. To you. To everything we built. Holloway exhaled, shaking his head slightly. That's where you're wrong, Reynolds. You weren't loyal to me. You were just useful. The words landed heavier than Reynolds expected. Carter isn't just some businessman, Holloway continued. He's a problem. A problem with too much influence. If this thing blows up, the whole foundation crumbles, and I'm not about to let you drag me down with you. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. He had been on the other side of conversations like this before, watching as someone else realized too late that their time was up. But now, it was his turn. I can fix this, he said quickly. Give me time. I can make him disappear. Holloway sighed, pushing back his chair and adjusting his cuffs. The two men standing near the doorway took a step forward. That's the thing, Holloway said, standing. I don't need you to fix it. One of the men opened the door. The other gestured toward it. Reynolds didn't move. You're making a mistake, he said, his voice low, desperate. Holloway smiled faintly. No, you did. Then the men grabbed him. Reynolds struggled, but it was useless. As they dragged him from the room, he realized something chilling. Holloway wasn't just cutting him loose. He was making sure he wouldn't be a problem ever again. Across the city, Lisa Torres sat in David Carter's apartment, scrolling through files on her laptop. The room was quiet except for the occasional click of a key. Carter stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker below. Holloway is too clean, Torres muttered, narrowing her eyes at the screen. Everything in his file is spotless. No mistakes, no controversy. It's like he's been erasing his tracks for decades. Carter turned from the window. That's not a coincidence. Torres nodded. She pulled up a photo on her screen. Holloway, standing beside high-ranking politicians, shaking hands with corporate executives. A man who had built his power in the shadows, never leaving a trail. If we're going to bring him down, she said, we need something solid. Carter folded his arms. And you think you know where to find it? Torres looked up at him, her expression unwavering. I have a lead. Meanwhile, in a dark alley on the south side of Chicago, a single gunshot shattered the night. Reynolds stumbled forward, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Blood soaked through his shirt, spreading warmth across his ribs. He pressed a trembling hand to the wound, staggering against the brick wall. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with blood, and pressed a number. The line rang once, twice, then connected. Carter's voice came through. Wary, Reynolds? The officer let out a ragged breath. If you want to take down Holloway? His voice was weak, fading. I have something you need. He coughed, pain flaring through his body. But you better hurry. I don't have much time. The abandoned warehouse stood in silence on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by rusting fences and forgotten debris. The dim glow of a flickering street lamp barely reached the cracked concrete outside, casting long, shifting shadows through the shattered windows. Inside, The air was thick with dampness and the faint metallic scent of old machinery. Mark Reynolds sat slumped against a wooden crate. His breathing labored. A blood-stained bandage was haphazardly wrapped around his side, barely stemming the wound that had nearly killed him hours ago. His fingers clutched his phone tightly, the only thing keeping him alive. The distant rumble of an engine echoed through the empty streets. A pair of headlights sliced through the darkness as David Carter's car came to a slow stop outside. The driver's door creaked open, and he stepped out, his posture tense. Beside him, Lisa Torres moved cautiously, her coat shifting slightly as her hand hovered near the holster beneath it. Inside the warehouse, Reynolds smirked weakly, watching them approach. "Took you long enough." Carter didn't move any closer. His expression was unreadable. "Talk." Reynolds let out a short, ragged chuckle. "No small talk? No sympathy for a dying man?" Carter folded his arms. "I'm not here to listen to you beg. What do you have?" Reynolds licked his dry lips and held up his phone. "The only thing keeping me breathing." He tapped the screen, and an audio file began to play. James Holloway's voice came through. Smooth, controlled. "If Carter keeps digging, we handle him like we handled the others." A brief silence. Then Holloway spoke again, this time with an edge of finality. "We own the cops, the courts, the press. He can't win." Lisa's jaw clenched. So Holloway isn't just protecting the system, he's eliminating anyone who threatens it. Carter exhaled slowly. He had suspected it, but hearing it laid out so plainly sent a cold wave through his chest. Reynolds shifted against the crate, wincing. "I can give you more. Names, transactions, everything, but I need something in return." Carter eyed him carefully. "And what's that?" Reynolds' grip on his phone tightened. "Protection. Get me out of Chicago. If I stay, I won't live long enough to testify." Lisa scoffed. "And you expect us to trust you?" Reynolds met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, just the exhausted look of a man who knew he was out of options. "I know you don't trust me. Hell, I wouldn't trust me either. But Holloway? He's not just coming for me. He's coming for both of you, too." Carter remained silent, studying the man before him. Reynolds had spent years abusing his badge, harassing people like Carter without a second thought. And yet, here he was, a broken pawn on the verge of being discarded by the very system he had served. If they let him die, they'd lose their best chance to take down Holloway. But saving him meant making a deal with a man Carter despised. Lisa shook her head. "This is a mistake, David. He's been part of the problem for too long." Carter's jaw tightened. He knew she was right. But he also knew that justice didn't come without compromise. Before he could answer, the world outside the warehouse erupted in light. Bright headlights flooded through the broken windows, slicing through the darkness like knives. The low growl of engines filled the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of car doors slamming shut. Reynolds' face went pale. "They found me." Lisa reached for her gun. Carter clenched his fists. There was no time left to decide. They had to run. The air inside the warehouse was thick with dust, the scent of rusted metal and damp concrete clinging to every surface. The dim glow of headlights outside sent shifting shadows through the broken windows, stretching across the floor like grasping hands. David Carter could feel the tension in the air, an almost electric charge that came with knowing death was just outside those walls. Reynolds groaned, clutching his side as he struggled to stay upright. His face was pale, a sheen of sweat glistening under the dim light. "They got here faster than I thought," he muttered. "Holloway really wants me dead." Lisa Torres crouched by the entrance, her gun already drawn. "No kidding," she shot back, her voice clipped. "We need to move, now." Carter peeked through the shattered window. 3 black SUVs idled outside, their engines humming low, menacing. The beams of their headlights cast long streaks of light across the lot, illuminating figures in dark clothing, weapons gleaming under the glow. Then, a voice rang out through a loudspeaker. "Mark Reynolds, it's over. Step outside, and maybe we'll make it quick." Reynolds' breath hitched. They weren't offering him a way out, they were offering him an execution. Carter turned to him. "You still think you can talk your way out of this?" Reynolds let out a shaky exhale. "Not anymore." Torres scanned the room, her eyes landing on a rusted side door. She motioned toward it. Exits blocked. 2 men standing guard. Carter nodded, quickly formulating a plan. He grabbed a metal pipe from the ground and hurled it across the warehouse. The clang echoed through the vast space, bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. The 2 guards near the exit instinctively turned toward the noise. Now, Torres whispered. In one fluid motion, she stepped out, fired 2 quick shots. One man dropped instantly. The other turned, raising his weapon. Too late. A second bullet took him down. Reynolds, gritting his teeth against the pain, grabbed the fallen man's gun and pressed himself against the doorframe. Torres shot Carter a look. We've got about 10 seconds before they realize what happened. Then let's not waste them, Carter said. They burst into the night. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets tearing into the air as they sprinted toward a row of abandoned shipping containers. Carter could hear the thud of rounds striking metal, sparks flying with each impact. We can't keep running, he shouted. They've got the numbers. Torres glanced around frantically. Then she saw it. A delivery truck, old and battered, sitting at the edge of the lot. The driver's side door was ajar. The keys dangled from the ignition. Get in, she yelled. Carter didn't hesitate. He slid into the passenger seat as Torres climbed behind the wheel. Reynolds tumbled into the back just as more shots rang out. Torres slammed the truck into gear, tires screeching against the pavement as they sped onto the highway. In the mirror, Carter saw the SUVs lurch into motion, their engines roaring as they gave chase. Reynolds groaned from the back. I hate to say it, but I don't think we're losing them. Torres gritted her teeth. We don't have to lose all of them. Just enough. Up ahead, a tunnel entrance loomed in the distance. Carter's mind raced. It was their best shot. Get inside the tunnel and hit the brakes, he said. Torres snapped her head toward him. Are you crazy? Trust me. With no time to argue, she slammed the accelerator. The tunnel swallowed them whole, the echoes of their roaring engine bouncing off the walls. Carter counted the seconds. Now, Torres yanked the emergency brake. The truck skidded sideways, tires screaming as the vehicle came to an abrupt halt. The first SUV barreled forward, too fast to stop. It slammed into the tunnel wall, metal crunching, flames bursting from the wreckage. The second SUV veered wildly, its driver swerving to avoid the flames, only to clip the tunnel's edge and flip onto its side. Only one remained. Carter turned to Torres. We just evened the odds. She threw the truck back into gear. Then let's finish this. The underground parking lot was almost silent, the sound of their heavy breathing the only thing filling the space. The flickering overhead lights cast long shadows across the damp concrete floor, making the abandoned structure feel even colder than it already was. Lisa Torres slammed the truck into park, and the 3 of them stumbled out, their bodies still tense from the high-speed chase. Carter pressed his hands to his knees, trying to catch his breath, while Reynolds leaned against a concrete pillar, clutching his wounded side. All right, Carter finally said, straightening up and turning toward Reynolds. You've been in this game a long time. Why would Holloway be so desperate to kill you over one mistake? Reynolds let out a dry laugh, wiping sweat from his brow. One mistake? He shook his head, his breath still ragged. You think this is about one mistake? I've been working for him for over a decade. I know things that would bury him and everyone tied to him. Lisa took a slow step forward, her hand resting on the holster beneath her coat. If you were so loyal, why would he turn on you now? He doesn't usually burn his assets unless they become a liability. Reynolds exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. His voice dropped lower. Because I know too much. And because I made a mistake. He looked at Carter. I underestimated you. Carter's jaw tightened. He wasn't sure if that was meant to be an insult or a reluctant admission of respect. Reynolds reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a small USB drive. He held it up between his fingers. This is why Holloway wants me dead. Carter narrowed his eyes. What's on it? Reynolds tossed it toward him, and Carter caught it effortlessly. A full record of Holloway's transactions over the last 5 years. Bribes, money laundering, off-the-books operations, even the names of people who disappeared after going against him. Lisa crossed her arms. And we're just supposed to trust that this is real? Reynolds met her gaze. I don't give a damn if you trust me. I just need to stay alive long enough to use it. Before Carter could respond, Lisa's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, glancing at the screen. A single text message flashed in bold letters. "Be careful, someone in your group is working for Holloway." Her grip on the phone tightened. She slowly lifted her gaze, scanning the two men standing in front of her. Carter noticed the shift in her posture immediately. "What is it?" Lisa took a step back, her fingers inching toward her gun. "Only 3 of us knew we were coming here," she said, her voice careful, measured. "But Holloway's men found us in less than 10 minutes. Carter's eyes darkened as the weight of her words settled in. "You're saying one of us tipped him off?" Reynolds pushed off the pillar, standing a little straighter despite his injury. "That's exactly what she's saying." Silence. Lisa's hand hovered near her gun. Carter's eyes flicked between the two men, his mind racing through the possibilities. Someone in their group was a traitor. And right now, no one could be trusted. The underground parking lot was silent except for the flickering hum of a dying fluorescent light overhead. The stale scent of oil and damp concrete clung to the air, thick and suffocating. David Carter stood still, his breath slow and steady. But his mind raced. Lisa Torres had her gun raised, her sharp gaze shifting between him and Mark Reynolds. "One of us tipped Holloway off," she said, her voice low but firm. "And I'm not leaving until I find out who." Reynolds scoffed, taking a careful step back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "You think I called Holloway?" he asked. "You really think I'd be here, bleeding out, if I were still on his payroll?" Carter exhaled sharply, gripping the USB drive in his palm. "Or maybe this is part of your act," he said, his voice cold. "Maybe you're just playing the long game, getting close enough to us to make us think we need you." Lisa's fingers flexed around her gun. She was weighing every word, every movement. She knew Carter was good at reading people. And right now, he was looking at her like a puzzle he was seconds away from solving. Then, something clicked in his mind. A missing piece. He looked at Lisa's phone still clutched in her other hand. "The message you got," he said, his voice suddenly calm. "If Holloway wanted you to know there was a rat in the group, why wouldn't he also tell you about the ambush?" Lisa blinked. Reynolds tilted his head, something resembling amusement flickering across his face. "He's got a point, Torres." Carter took a slow step forward, watching her reaction. It wasn't a warning, it was a distraction, a way to make you turn on us before we turned on you. Lisa's expression didn't change, but Carter caught the subtle shift, the flicker of hesitation. Then, in one swift motion, he struck out, knocking the gun from her grasp. Reynolds didn't hesitate. He grabbed the fallen weapon, stepping back and leveling it at Lisa in a smooth, practiced motion. Lisa slowly raised her hands, but there was no fear in her eyes, no regret. "Smart," she admitted, her voice cool. Carter stared at her, anger bubbling under his skin. "How long?" Lisa tilted her head slightly. "It's not what you think." "Then explain it to me," Carter said, taking another step closer. Lisa exhaled through her nose. "I don't work for Holloway." Reynolds let out a dry laugh. "Oh yeah? Then who the hell are you working for?" Lisa held Carter's gaze. "Someone bigger." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Reynolds' grip on the gun tightened. "So you're saying we've been running from the wrong person this whole time?" Lisa's phone buzzed in her hand. Carter's eyes dropped to the screen just as she did. A single message. "Good work. Keep Carter there. We're on our way." Carter's stomach tightened. They weren't just up against Holloway anymore. They were up against something much worse. A sliver of morning light bled through the cracks in the concrete ceiling, casting long shadows across the abandoned underground parking lot. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settled in your chest and refused to leave. Lisa Torres stood in the center of it all, still and composed, despite the gun Reynolds had trained on her. Carter watched her carefully, waiting. "You're not working for Holloway," he said, his voice level but firm. "But you tipped someone off. Someone bigger." Lisa exhaled, rolling her shoulders slightly as if shaking off an invisible weight. "You really think Holloway is the one pulling the strings?" she asked. "He's nothing more than a shark in a tank full of monsters." Reynolds scowled, his grip tightening on the gun. "Enough with the riddles. If Holloway isn't the top of the chain, then who is?" Lisa tilted her head, her gaze steady, Who controls the police budget? Who decides where funding goes? Who protects guys like Holloway when they need cover? Carter's stomach tightened. A name formed in his mind before she even said it. Mayor Raymond Wallace. Lisa nodded. Carter's pulse quickened. Raymond Wallace wasn't just any politician. He had built his entire career on law and order, preaching about cracking down on crime while securing millions in funding for the police. He had the press in his pocket, the department under his thumb. And now, Carter realized, he had been orchestrating this entire game. Reynolds let out a bitter laugh. So everything I did for Holloway, all the times I looked the other way, all the people I kept in check, was just to protect some politician? Lisa's expression was unreadable. Who do you think kept you on the force despite all the complaints? Who made sure every internal investigation into you went nowhere? Reynolds' jaw clenched. He had spent years believing he had power, that his badge gave him control over the streets. Now, he saw the truth. He had been a disposable piece in a much larger machine. Carter turned his attention back to Lisa. Why tell me this? He asked. If you work for Wallace, you should be putting a bullet in my head right now. Lisa hesitated, just for a moment, but it was enough. Because for the first time, she said slowly, I'm wondering if I'm on the wrong side. The words hung between them. A crack in her armor. A sign that, maybe, she wasn't as far gone as she thought. Carter took a slow step forward. Then help me bring him down. Lisa didn't move. Then, her phone buzzed. Carter saw her expression shift as she glanced at the screen. A single message. If you don't handle Carter now, don't bother coming back. Lisa's fingers tightened around the phone. Carter watched her carefully. Reynolds did too. They all knew what came next. The warehouse stood silent against the Chicago skyline, its rusted metal walls groaning in the cold wind from the river. The air smelled of damp wood and oil. A perfect hideout, or a perfect trap. Carter and Reynolds stepped inside, their footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. Lisa Torres stood in the center, her expression unreadable. The dim glow of a single overhead light cast long shadows across her face. She raised her hands slightly, a silent reassurance. I didn't call anyone else. We need to talk. Reynolds, still gripping his gun tightly, let out a short laugh. Talk? You just got orders to kill Carter. Forgive me if I don't feel like chatting. Lisa's jaw tightened. I got the order. That doesn't mean I'm going to follow it. Carter took a measured step forward. Then what do you want? Lisa hesitated, her fingers twitching at her side. I want to take Wallace down. Reynolds scoffed. Oh, now you grow a conscience? Lisa shot him a sharp look. You think this is easy for me? I spent my whole career believing I was doing the right thing, keeping order. But Wallace, he's not about order. He's about control. Carter studied her carefully. He could see the cracks in her resolve, the war raging inside her. You have a choice, he said, his voice calm but firm. You can stand with us, or you can be another piece of his machine. Lisa exhaled slowly. Before she could answer, a blinding flood of headlights burst through the warehouse windows. Engines roared outside, tires screeching to a halt. Then, the first bullet shattered the window. Lisa dove for cover as a hail of gunfire ripped through the walls. Carter and Reynolds threw themselves behind a stack of wooden crates as the deafening echo of automatic weapons filled the space. Wallace isn't here to talk, Lisa shouted over the noise. No kidding, Carter yelled back, pulling his own gun. A group of armed men, dressed in tactical gear, stormed inside. Their movements were precise, calculated. This wasn't just some hit squad. This was Wallace's personal cleanup crew. Lisa fired first, dropping one of them before they could react. Reynolds, wincing from his injured shoulder, gritted his teeth and returned fire. They really don't want us leaving here alive. Carter ducked behind a crate as bullets splintered the wood. He scanned the area, looking for an opening. Any opening. Then he saw it. A service door, half hidden behind a stack of rusted barrels. He turned to Lisa. Cover me. Lisa nodded, laying down suppressing fire as Carter sprinted toward the door. Reynolds fired 2 quick shots, hitting another attacker before staggering back against the crates. He was losing blood fast. We need to get out of here, he gasped. Carter reached the door and shoved it open. Now, Lisa grabbed Reynolds, half dragging him as they made their way toward the exit. Carter covered them, emptying the last few rounds in his clip before shoving through the door after them. Outside, a black SUV idled near the river. The remaining gunmen were retreating. Climbing into the vehicle, Carter caught a voice through one of their radios as the door slammed shut. "Abort mission. Wallace wants this handled another way." The SUV sped off into the night. Carter turned to Lisa and Reynolds. Reynolds, pale from blood loss, managed a weak smirk. "We won this round, but he's not done." Lisa holstered her gun, her face set with grim determination. "Neither are we." Carter clenched his jaw, staring after the disappearing taillights. Wallace had just escalated the war, and Carter was ready to fight. The sun had barely risen over Chicago, casting a muted glow over the towering skyline. Inside City Hall, Raymond Wallace sat in his lavish office, gripping a steaming cup of coffee he had no intention of drinking. His gaze was fixed on the city below, where people moved about, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon his empire. A knock at the door broke his trance. A nervous aide entered, clutching a newspaper with trembling hands. "Sir, it's all over the news." The aide stammered. "The recordings, the financial records, the cover-ups, they leaked everything." Wallace exhaled sharply, extending his hand for the paper. The front-page headline struck like a hammer. "Chicago Police Scandal Exposed. Holloway's Corruption Leads to City Hall." Wallace clenched his jaw. He knew exactly who was responsible. David Carter and Lisa Torres. Carter strikes back. Across town, David Carter stood inside a dimly lit newsroom, preparing for an exclusive interview. Nathan Ellis adjusted the microphone on his suit jacket. "Are you ready for this?" the reporter asked. Carter met his gaze through the mirror, his expression unreadable. "This isn't about me. It's about all the people this system has crushed." Moments later, the live broadcast began. Carter faced the camera, his voice steady yet charged with purpose. "The truth is out, but truth alone isn't enough," he declared. "We've seen time and time again how corruption disguises itself, how power protects its own. This is about more than one man. It's about dismantling a system designed to silence those who stand against it." Outside City Hall, a growing crowd gathered, holding signs, chanting, demanding action. The scandal had ignited something deeper, a city-wide reckoning. Wallace's phone buzzed. The caller ID displayed an unlisted number. He knew exactly who it was. The voice on the other end was devoid of sympathy. "You're a liability now, Wallace. Handle it, or we will." Wallace swallowed hard. The very system that had shielded him for years was now preparing to discard him. Wallace's last move, determined to reclaim control of the narrative. Wallace scheduled a press conference. He would twist the facts, frame himself as the victim of a political smear campaign. As he stepped onto the podium, cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. He straightened his tie, preparing to speak. Then the unmistakable sound of sirens cut through the air. Lisa Torres emerged from the crowd, her uniform crisp, her badge gleaming under the morning sun. She climbed onto the stage, flanked by federal agents. In one hand, she held a warrant. "Mayor Wallace," she announced, her voice echoing across the courtyard. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and accessory to murder." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Wallace went pale as cuffs snapped around his wrists. "This is a mistake," he bellowed. "You're all being played." Lisa didn't flinch. "No, for once, the system is working the way it should." The final reckoning. From a distance, Carter watched the scene unfold, arms crossed. This was what justice was supposed to look like. Yet, something inside him remained unsettled. Wallace was just one piece of the puzzle. The system itself, the deeply rooted corruption, the unspoken alliances, still loomed like a shadow over the city. And then, the last loose end. Mark Reynolds had vanished. Despite his injuries, he had managed to slip away. A man like him wouldn't disappear forever. He was still out there. A reminder that justice was never truly final. Epilogue. A city in transition. Days later, Lisa Torres submitted her resignation. She had done her part. But she knew real change required more than one arrest. Carter returned to his company. But the world now saw him as more than just a CEO. His face was plastered across billboards, alongside a simple yet powerful statement: justice is not a privilege, it's a right. Yet, deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. Justice had won the day. But would it survive tomorrow? In the end, justice wasn't handed down, it was fought for. David Carter exposed the corruption. But the battle against abuse of power is far from over. How many more hidden figures like Wallace are still pulling the strings? And how many more lives are at risk before real change happens? What do you think? Was justice truly served? Or is the system just finding its next puppet? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more untold stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truths, because the truth is always deeper than it seems.